Today we have my friend, Dr. Bryan Loritts. He is a teaching pastor at the Summit Church over in North Carolina. He has written multiple books, one of his most recent books, Insider, Outsider. And Bryan, if you wouldn't mind, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe some things I might have missed or things that are just even going on in your life in this COVID virus we find ourselves in.
Yeah, these are unique times, aren't they? Well, first, let me say, Grant, it's great being with you. You and the work that you do gives me great hope for the coming generation. So, yeah, I would say one of the more important things is the fact that my wife and I just celebrated 21 years of marriage, married to Corey Loritts, and we've got 3 sons: Quentin, who's 19, Miles, who's 17, and Jaden, who is 15. I have always had a passion, in my ministry career for the multi-ethnic church. So I'm really laboring to see the multi-ethnic church become the new normal in our society. So gospel-centered, disciple-making multi-ethnic churches is what I'm always striving towards. So it's a privilege to be a part of that.
Yeah, and you've written a couple books on the topic. Even the letters to a Birmingham jail, as well as, even the Right Color, Wrong Culture. It was huge for me to even see a new lens for the church. But so, and for any new people listening or watching today, this Candid Conversations, we've been able to do this. We kind of switch off. It's always Todd Wilson, president of Exponential, who's on here. Maybe Todd, you want to say hi or anything?
Hello. Good to have you, Bryan. So glad you're here today.
Always great being with you, Todd.
Yeah, and then he switches off with me or Ephraim Smith, and we've both been doing different interviews and co-hosting. But I mean, one of the questions, even just to start out with, Bryan, was since you wrote Insider, Outsider, I would assume about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, if you talk about actually writing the book and then all the time it takes to produce it and publish it, how much do you think it speaks even more so into where we are today since writing the book?
Yeah, so the book came out in the fall of 2018. In fact, my book, Insider Outsider, came out the same day as Eric Mason's Woke Church. 2 different publishers. We didn't plan that, and neither could we forecast 2020, especially from a racial lens. So, what I really try to present in that book, I think, unfortunately, is timeless, and that is, I just argue that, man, we've got to have white evangelicals. I love white evangelicals, but we need to go to war with white evangelicalism. And it's the ism part that I think historically in our country, what's happened is the original evangelicals in our country were the Puritans. And I love their books, and they've got an incredible soteriology, but they've got feet of clay, and while they had an incredible soteriology, they had a horrible anthropology. And so, we could talk about Cotton Mather and the fact that when he negotiated his pastoral package at a church he was going to, actually a slave was a part of the negotiation deal. He named it a biblical name, Onesimus, called it. And so you're just going, man, how do these great men of God just completely miss it in this area? And that's kind of a legacy that we're seeing to this day. And unfortunately, racism continues to nip at our heels among white evangelicalism, but it's not so much an overt active as much as it is a passive. And it's seen in such phrases as, man, just preach the gospel, as if the gospel doesn't entail issues of injustice. And so what I argue for is we need to dismantle evangelicalism, and we need evangelicals, and we need to be mutually submitting to and learning from one another within the fences of biblical orthodoxy.
Bryan, if you just an insider outsider,
the theme of this topic. Go ahead, Bryan.
Oh, can you hear me, Bryan?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, a little bit. Just give the backstory that led to writing Insider Outsider. Every story, every book has a backstory. What's the backstory?
Absolutely. So I had written an article for Christianity Today. My friend Ed Stetzer had reached out to me. I think it was in the early part of 2016, where some of these thoughts were percolating. And that just got overwhelming appeal. And then in a 6-week stretch in November to early December of 2016, it just poured out of me. And really, of course, we know what's going on there. President Trump has won the election. Now, again, I am not here to criticize or try to sway people's mind or whatever. What I was reacting to was the deep division that I just felt like had bubbled to the surface. And I wanted to speak in such a way that wasn't necessarily a polemic or a didactic kind of a deal as much as it is my own personal narrative. Because we can argue perception of facts all day long. We cannot argue experience. And so that moment was really the catalyst. And Insider Outsider really is a thematic memoir as it relates to the stages of my life being immersed in white evangelicalism.
And Grant, you can jump in here, but this idea of experience, Bryan, we do steer away from the politics thing as much as we can. So I'm not looking to get into the polarization of politics, but when it comes to the experiential part you're talking about, if we went back 55 years, like all the way back to 1965 at this point, what we would call white evangelicals vote for the Republican candidate on average 80% of the time. African Americans vote for the Democratic candidate 90% of the time, literally every time, 90% of the time. Just that, if you want to call that a polarization, or it's definitely a difference. Talk to us about the experiential part that causes that you think underpins that. Like, what causes that to be different?
So I have a whole section in my book, Insider Outsider, called Trumped, in which we get into politics. And one of the things that I say there is that politics is a sport played by the subjective. So no one is completely objective when they go into the voting booth. And I am not putting any kind of a moral label on that. We tend to vote our felt needs, right? So if I'm poor and living in some urban community, that's going to sway how I vote. If I'm middle to upper middle class, living in a suburban community, that's going to play a part for how I vote. And again, I'm not attaching any moral value to it. So I think both sides, there is this sense of subjectivity to it. Now, what's interesting, though, is in 1965, right around that time, we've got the Voting Rights Act, there's the Civil Rights Act, and it's a Democratic president, LBJ, who's pushing these things through. And I want to be careful. The historical record is clear. LBJ wasn't necessarily gung-ho when it came to African Americans. But before that, African Americans were Republican. And that goes all the way back, by and large, to Lincoln. But when LBJ pushes these massive legislative deals through, the pendulum now swings. You got the Dixiecrats who now pull over, and they do a coup, and they now become Republicans. African Americans, who many of them were Republicans, now become Democrat, and we haven't lost that over the last 50 plus years.
Yeah, and would you say, Grant, I'm going to let you jump in, but just to close that out, if we bring the church in, then that difference, both positive, negative, without drawing any judgments on it, is that distinction between the voting practices because of the church, in spite of the church? Like, where does evangelicalism and Christianity fit in the voting pattern? Is it more driven by secular experience or church experience, or where does church fit into that equation?
Well, if you read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which I would say is the most valuable part of the book that I edited, Letters to a Birmingham Jail. The King family let us take that whole letter, and it's the introduction. One of the things that we see is King goes to jail during the Birmingham campaign. I think it's on Good Friday, around then, the spring of 1963. While in jail, an open letter is penned by 10 clergy who are white, and in essence, what they're saying, it's a passive deal. They're saying, "Well, King, you and your lieutenants, y'all just wait. You don't need to push things. Just be patient." And King is responding to clergy. And one of the things that unfortunately makes his letter still relevant to this day is King is not railing against the KKK. He's not railing against the Bull Connors of the world. He's railing against, his words, what he calls the white moderate. And he says, "I've stood in southern towns and I've seen your churches, and they are glorious and they are beautiful pieces of architecture, but they're in segregated communities." And he goes, "I wonder what kind of Christian goes there? What kind of person attends there?" And that's why I'm saying, unfortunately, it's still relevant, because today we still have a passive church that's late to the game. And one of the ways we see it is, on the one hand, while I'm grateful, I've never experienced this much white empathy and advocacy, especially in the aftermath of George Floyd. And these protests have been multi-ethnic. It's brought tears to my eyes. It's great. But part of me feels like it's almost a little too late. Like this movement, it's a leaderless movement by and large. And it used to be centered in the church during the civil rights movement. But I think because of the passivity of the modern day church, we've lost our witness and our credibility to the world.
Can the church grab that leadership role back at this point, or are you concerned it can't grab that leadership role back?
Look, I'm always going to be hopeful. I absolutely believe so. My eschatology, I see that framework between, creation, fall, redemption, restoration, and I think we're in the process of trying to restore things, and that's not just spiritual. That's also profoundly tangible, physical, sociological. And so I'm hopeful, but what it can't be is just the black church. So if we are going to topple systems of injustice, it can't be those at the bottom, the powerless, who do it. We need our white brothers and sisters to lock arms with us, because they are still the powerful to help us to dismantle these issues of systemic injustice.
Yeah, Bryan, it's pretty powerful to say. Sometimes I feel like it's maybe too late. However, I've experienced that and even seen that from some of my friends, where it's like, man, I'm tired of answering questions about what to read. I'm tired of being like the object of education. I've brought this up so much, and now it's like, now you guys are coming to me all the time. And so I know the theme of this conversation is what people of color wish white leaders knew. I would want to ask the question right now, in light of what you just said, and acknowledging it, some people are just tired or feel like it's too late. Instead of what do people of color wish white people knew, what do you think people of color wish white people would do right now?
Yeah, so I would say, one, we need you to preach a holistic gospel. And really what I want to appeal to is, I think every Christian should strive to be an Ephesians 2 Christian, the whole chapter. Ephesians 2, 1 through 10, if you grew up in a conservative church, you know that almost by heart. I mean, it's all about vertical reconciliation. This is who we were prior to Christ, but God being rich in mercy. And then several times Paul says, "For by grace you have been saved, for by grace you have been saved." We love that, but keep reading. And if you keep reading, now we get to verse 11, and he says, "Therefore," which you don't have to spend a day in seminary to figure this out, that what he is about to say, he's going to connect with what he's just said, "You Gentiles in the flesh." Again, you don't have to spend a day in seminary, Grant, to figure out. He's now talking about issues of ethnic diversity and unity. So he goes from vertical reconciliation to horizontal reconciliation. And so because of that, I've always, I think we need to preach a framework that the gospel is both vertical and horizontal. I want to be clear. I am not saved based on what I do for the poor. I'm not saved based on, my relationships with people who are ethnically different. However, Just as I would say an unforgiving Christian is an oxymoron or a greedy Christian is an oxymoron, I would at the same time say an ethnically indifferent or racist Christian is an oxymoron. And so ethnic unity is an indicator light bearing witness to the authenticity of my salvation. And what the conservative church has historically done is we've just preached verses 1 through 10 of Ephesians 2, and we leave out the horizontal implications of that. And we've preached a disjointed gospel. So what do I wish the white church would do? Preach a holistic gospel and encourage your people to live a holistic Ephesians 2 kind of life.
Yeah.
And
I have
Bryan,
a personal question real quick for you, Bryan. This was like the one question just selfishly maybe I wanted to ask you is, you have a unique role in that I feel like you've been a translator for many years now, in the sense that similar to myself, I often speak a lot, but I'm not speaking to people my own age. I'm actually like translating young people to older people, or I joke chronologically superior people, because they don't like being called older. So I would say chronologically emphasis on superior people. But you're in this place where it's like grown up predominantly in Black churches, but I mean, over the last 10, 15 years, you've been in a lot of places where you're the person of color translating in maybe predominantly white churches. When you look at your story, do you see like signs? Do you have any stories where you could share like, oh, I could see God preparing me for this role and for this time?
All right, so let me make the point and then give you one quick story. I've made up in my mind I want to be a reconciler, not an activist. Those are two different things.
Yeah, that's good.
So activists are issue driven, right? So we got to, have police reform or whatever the issue is. We're issue driven. Activists are concerned about the what. Praise God for them.
Yeah.
Reconcilers take it to a next step. While activists are concerned about the what, reconcilers are concerned about the who and the how. So that while activists are issue driven, reconcilers are people driven.
That's good.
And so I want to bring people together. I'm not just for diversity. I want people to walk in close relationship. And so that's why, Grant, I get in trouble all the time because I say things like white privilege is a real thing, white supremacy is a real thing. But I don't like using those terms, because a lot of times when you use those terms, you cut off a whole group of people. So if bringing people together means I just need to shift my language and I can still deal with these very real concepts, then that's what I'll do. So I want to be in that lane, and I want to encourage people to pick up what Paul called the ministry reconciliation, which I know primarily is vertical, but it's also got to be horizontal. Now for the story. Real quick, I was at my godfather's church in Inglewood, fresh out of, while going through seminary, 13,000 person Black church, spring of 1998. God calls me out of there to join a predominantly white church in Pasadena as their first African-American pastor on staff in the history of that church, over 100 years. And I walked in there like Jonah walked into Nineveh. See, Jonah's interesting because Jonah shows us that you can preach the gospel, but you can do it from a posture of bitterness and racism. Yeah. And that's how I was when I walked into Lake. And what God had to do to me there was those people, those white people loved me like I've never been loved before. And it was a really transformative time in which I had to say, just because you're white and just because you're wealthy does not mean you don't have a heart. And what God did was, as my friend Eric Mason says, proximity breeds empathy. That now I began to just live in close relationship with them, and it began to buff off the abrasive edges of my life in ministry.
This idea, Bryan, of being sensitive to words. I mean, if there's anything we're seeing as we're trying to really engage, at Exponential this fall, we're shifting from big regional events to over 100 roundtable events, focused exclusively on race conversations. And I have been surprised at, I shouldn't have been, but I have been surprised at the how strong the emotional responses to words are, to like just individual words. So if you could play a little bit further into this idea of the one thing you wish people would do is preach the holistic gospel. Even that, if you said that to 100 white pastors, many of them are going to say, "What are you talking about? I do." What's the push into it a little bit more of what you see keeping them from doing it, and even give them a little bit more handle on the definition of that, like of what it means to do that.
Yeah, so a couple things come to mind, and I actually explore this again in my book, Insider Outsider. I think in some senses, some of my conservative evangelical friends have been handcuffed by systematic theology. And I think systematic theology is helpful. It allows us to, as Tom Nelson says, palm our Bibles. But you can never contain the infinite God in a man-made system. So, for example, dispensationalism, which was a classic dispensationalism, which was a 19th century invention that was later on peddled by the likes of Charles Ryrie and C.I. Scofield. It says Israel's over here, church is over here, kingdom is yet future. And so because of that, we only need to really preach to the souls of people, right? Dispensationalists didn't march in the streets of Birmingham or Selma. It's interesting to think D.L. Moody, listen, I love D.L. Moody, but it's interesting to think that him and Ida B. Wells lived in the same city at the same time, but never worked with each other. And so because this system preached kingdom is yet future, it was a middle to upper middle class, affluent, white way of viewing the scriptures. What I mean by that is when I'm living in poverty, when I have to trust God for a bus pass, I want some of the kingdom to be right now. So see how different that is? And so the reason why some of my white conservative brothers can preach just kind of the vertical dimensions of the gospel is because they've been blinded by affluence, some of them, right? And so I would also say they need to read Jesus. If you read Matthew 25, 31, 46, when Jesus talks about the sheep and the goats will be on his left, and they will be cast into hell. And the difference is, whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done also to me. I mean, if Jesus preaches that sermon now, in the totality in which he gives it, his inbox is going to be full. Because what it seems like what he's saying is that if you want to get into heaven, you've got to be generous towards the poor, which we understand in its theological context is not what he's saying. But still, if you understand the ministry of Jesus, both what he taught and what he modeled, and when he came to bring the kingdom, there was a vertical dimension, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But there was a horizontal dimension where he was feeding people and clothing people and healing people. And oftentimes he does those things without even preaching the vertical dimensions of the gospel. So even if you just follow the model of Jesus, Jesus shows us by way of life that there's a holistic gospel that must be lived out.
Bryan, in the book, you kind of have a very practical breakdown of like the 5 levels of communication in the pyramid. Would you be able to kind of explain that for the audience?
Yes. So I think the communication pyramid is really helpful as it relates to ethnic unity. And I would encourage us to take a deep dive into this. If you're a pastor tuning in or whoever you are, maybe with your small group or with some friends. In essence, what it says is there's 5 levels of communication. And so, number one, the very surface level communication is cliche. Good morning, how are you? You've communicated, but you really haven't communicated. Next 2 levels I call sports center talk. It's where most guys hang out. Level 2 is facts, sharing what you know, who won the game, how many points did LeBron have. Level 3 is opinion, sharing what you think. But levels 4 and 5 are indicator lights that allow us to assess the health of our deepest friendships and relationships. Level 4 is emotive. It's sharing how I feel. Level 5 is transparency. It's sharing who you are. Now, here's what happens. Ahmaud Arbery happens, or Breonna Taylor happens, or George Floyd happens, or I can go back to Michael Brown or Eric Garner. What happens is, because the African American community is a communal community, When these things happen, we immediately go level 4, right? Emotive. This is how we feel. Our white brothers and sisters tend to hang out at level 2. Well, hold on, we don't know the facts. And to me, that's where we miss each other. If you're married, I'll talk to married guys. If you're married and your wife comes to you at level 4 and you hang out at lawyer land at level 2, that's not a recipe for empathy and oneness. If I want to be one with my bride, Corey, I need to first drop down to level 4 and feel with her until we resurface back up to level 2 facts. And so I just feel like what needs to happen when these things take place is, yes, we can get to facts later, but let's first stop and feel before we get to facts.
Do you feel like when we talk about communication and especially between different people, how has the conversation changed over the last 10, 15 years? Because like this isn't your first book on this topic. You've written several, and yeah, how do you feel like just the arc of the conversation has changed, and why do you think it's changed over the last, just to say, 10 years?
Dramatically, and in a good way, I feel like. So my dad and I were just talking about this the other night. He was hanging out with us, and he said, 1968, I was a freshman in college. Dr. King gets assassinated. He goes, I'm at a white college. No one said a word. And just imagine that. No one says.
That's crazy.
And he goes, man, the loneliness that I felt in that. Let me fast forward to 1991 or 92, when the Rodney King verdict comes out. There was a sense in which, it's kind of whispers in the hallways. Maybe a professor said something, but there was no real sense of empathy. Again, I'm at a white Bible college. There was no sense of let's pray about this in chapel, or for sure there was no, let's protest or lament, none of that. But Grant, here's where I think you're a real gift, because the younger generation, they have this justice edge to them that is refreshing. Now, are there some problems? Of course, but there's a wiring there that I haven't seen in previous generations. And I'm talking specifically, well, across the board, but specifically with the white younger generation, and that's beautiful to me. And call me, hopelessly optimistic. I mean, they're the first ones to take to the streets. They're the first ones to, chant stuff like Black Lives Matter. And there's a lot I think my generation and older generations can learn from the younger. So I'm hopeful in what I'm seeing in the younger generations.
Yeah, it's changed. It's changed. I mean, even this last 10 years for me. Real quick question. I mean, if you were speaking to young Christians that are on the front lines of this conversation, and now they're building on the foundation that you guys have given us in generation before, what would it be like? Quick words of advice, like, hey, keep pushing here, and also watch out for this.
Yeah. So I would say let the gravitational pull to your advocacy always be the gospel. So let everything you do orbit around the gospel, because our progressive and liberal friends, and I don't use that pejoratively, they're out in the streets protesting as well. They believe in diversity. There's just nothing weighty or substantive to actually pull it together. And so I would say, if you call yourself a Christian, what's got to differentiate us from others is, man, there's just this weightiness, this gravitational pull of the gospel of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, that I think needs to be evident. And we can give a cup of cold water in Jesus' name. So I would say that's the primary thing, which is why I'm quick to parse out the difference between the sentiment Black Lives Matter from the structure or the system of Black Lives Matter. Because what I read in the structure, wanting to get rid of the nuclear family and think, well, the gospel in me won't let me get with that part of what you're doing, but the gospel in me will also take to the streets and yell out the sentiment as well. And so I'm concerned that the younger generation can get carried away and go down some trails that are in direct opposition to the gospel because they can elevate justice over the centrality of the cross of Christ, if that makes sense.
Yep.
We're going to take a couple more questions here, Bryan, and then I'm going to encourage those who are watching live right now to put through the chat your questions. We're starting to get some questions in, and we're going to begin asking your questions here in just a couple of minutes to Bryan. So be sure in the chat there to put your questions in. Bryan, a couple of things, sort of random here. One of the things we do on Candid Conversations is even this idea of words and definitions and so forth. Let me go really high level for a minute. Your book talks about, and you've mentioned, white evangelicalism. Just give us a simple definition for people who might say, yeah, I consider myself a Christian, but I don't really know what that is. How would you just simply define it?
Yeah, it's a theological point of view that has been elevated to an unhealthy level of power that is actually oppressive. And so one of the things that I argue is it's impossible to study the Bible objectively. We all carry how we're made, how we're wired, our worldview into the text. So I see things as a man, but at the same time, my maleness blinds me from a healthy female perspective. I see things as a black man. You see things as a white man. One of the things I do when I teach a class on preaching at a seminary is the first day I ask the question, what's black preaching? What's black theology? And this mostly white class, hands will go up. Well, then I go, well, what's white preaching? What's white theology? Silence. See, it's hard to identify and speak to what you have mainstreamed and normalized. And so I would say, just like water is to a fish, white evangelicalism is to modern day Christianity. And so we've taken a perspective and we've elevated it. So, for example, this whole concept of being disqualified from ministry, we must understand that's nowhere found in the Bible. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul talks about being disqualified for the prize, right? But there he's talking eternal rewards. I'm not saying you shouldn't fire somebody, but what I am saying is that phrase, disqualified from ministry, I never heard that in the black church. It wasn't until I got to the white church that I heard that. So there are some things, and white is not a four-letter word, there are some things that are specific to the white church that white church has now mainstreamed and says everybody's got to follow this. And I'll say this lastly, part of my concern is white evangelicalism now has gotten into bed with the Republican Party. And I think we've got to be careful of that. I think you should vote your conscience. I think you should vote your convictions. I'm not elevating one party over the other. Here's what I do know. The kingdom of God cannot nestle neatly within one political party. And so Tim Keller says in his book, Preaching, that robust preaching, people should always leave my sermons going one week, does he watch Fox News? And then the next week, maybe, is he watching MSNBC? Because the kingdom of God is so much bigger than that. And so if you're completely comfortable, for example, with one political party, I'm not sure you are really living into the fullness of the kingdom of heaven. And that cuts both ways.
Hey, I want to start kind of giving you some questions, Bryan, from the chat. And also just encourage anyone that's listening, if you guys want to ask some practical questions, personal questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But Bryan, here's a question. It says, I'm just going to read it to you. It said, Bryan, I've got a good number of earnest white folk in my church who want concrete direction. What should I do? What might be some clear, concrete things a predominantly white church might do as a community or as individuals? Have you seen white churches doing creative things like sharing staff or regular financial giving?
Yeah, so I think we've got to take a multi-tiered approach, and I appreciate the heart of the question. Number one is lament. I think we've got to first stop and lament, and in order to lament well, we've got to listen well. I think if we bypass lament on our way to quick solutions, that's a cheap reconciliation. And Job's friends were at their best the first 7 days when they just sat in the ashes and didn't say anything. So I think the same is true for us.
Yeah,
I think in general the church just does a horrible job listening to each other. And if you don't believe that, go to someone's Facebook page. We just don't listen well. And so I think that step one's lament. Step two, it's not that glamorous, but I've been doing this work for a long time, and at the end of the day, the secret sauce is relationships. You just need relationships with the ethnically other. And it doesn't mean every or most times you get together, you're talking about ethnically specific issues. You're just doing life with one another. A great book to read along these lines is Reggie Williams' book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. It was a groundbreaking book to me. Because one of the things Reggie Williams points to is the power of relationships and how that formed Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So, for example, Bonhoeffer was this prodigy. I think he graduated his PhD around 2021. In the 1930s, he comes to Harlem to do a fellowship over at Union, which is right in the heart of Harlem, which is right in the 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer ends up joining a historically black church, the Abyssinian Baptist Church, which is still around to this day. So he's listening to black preaching, and this is what Bonhoeffer says. It's the first time in my life I heard the fullness of the gospel in all of its glorious implications. He teaches Sunday school. He befriends a guy named Albert. Albert turns him on to Negro spirituals. Bonhoeffer falls in love with him, takes him back to his makeshift seminary when he goes back across the pond. Albert takes him on a trip down south in the 1930s. He sees the ugliness of Jim Crow. Here's what I'm trying to say with all that. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's conclusion is, I do not go back to Germany to fight for the oppressed without first taking a stop in Harlem and hearing the gospel lived out and preached to the oppressed. What is he saying? What formed me and transformed me wasn't just reading the Word of God, as powerful as that is. It was immersing myself in ethnically other community. We need that. That's not an elective. That is core curriculum to the Christian life.
I never knew that story. I've never heard that before. And it really triggers for me when I hear you say that. Have you recently seen this post for all I know you've known about it for a while, but I just saw a post about Albert Einstein coming to America. It's been a pretty significant time at black colleges, and I'd never heard these stories of certain white, very glorified individuals, and they're not just relationship but conviction when it comes to reconciliation.
Yeah, Einstein spoke out, vociferously against injustice, and he spoke at a lot of HBCUs. Everybody was trying to give him an honorary doctorate or whatever, and Einstein wouldn't do too many of those, but he did. He went to Lincoln and Philadelphia and so on and so forth. Another thing about Bonhoeffer is, that phrase "cheap grace."
Yeah.
He didn't coin that. He got that from Adam Clayton Powell, his black pastor at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. So I think that's an important narrative that we need to incarnate that in our own lives.
Yeah.
So Bryan, we've got another question here that, we're living in divisive times. We're entering probably a divisive political cycle right now with an election coming up. So how do we maneuver the political cycle to be able to stay focused on healthy race conversations amidst a political cycle, especially for church leaders that are, some of their churches are polarized even on the political spectrum?
So I want to encourage us, and maybe what I'm about to say is a little counterintuitive. We're wrestling with this at our church right now, and the thing I've been encouraging our leadership here is, I think a lot of churches, seasons like this, they just kind of ignore it and they say, let's just stay as far away as possible from it. I actually think, especially just given the uniqueness of this year, I think we actually need to run to it and use this election cycle in a redemptive way to try to foster ethnic unity. And that's why I would just say, if you're a leader in your church, passages like Romans 14 is your friend. Because what Paul is doing in Romans 14 is, he's showing how to navigate lesser matters in such a way that they don't cause division. And politics is a lesser matter. It's not essential to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Once I check that box, I think now I can walk through Romans 14 in a healthy way. Where he talks about the weaker brother, and I think we've got to speak to those things in such a way that we're not endorsing a party or belittling a party, but actually saying how can we draw near with one another. But it's a lot of planning. I think you can preach on it. That's the air war. But the ground war, I think, has to be, we have to work these things out in small groups within the context of community. We need to understand one another in ways that are healthy without trying to change each other. You know what I'm saying? And so we just got to make room for one another.
Quick question. Even on that comment, I was listening to an interview with you where you said about like not going to the table to change each other, but I think you said we're not issues to be solved, we are people to be loved. I thought that was really powerful. Here's a question from, I think will be pretty fun. I already know I'm going to have a follow-up, so be ready for that. So the question is, I'm white with several black friends who tell me that white people don't know how to do church. And they say it with love and they joke, but they say white church is too quiet and stiff. They don't want to be a part of the white church. When you're talking about white evangelicals versus black evangelicals, what are you saying? Are you saying that we need to integrate on Sunday mornings to end racism?
So I hear a couple questions there. One is, I don't want to elevate one ethnicity over another as it relates to how we do things. I do think we can learn from each other. And there are valuable things that I have learned and am continuing to learn from my white brothers and sisters. And I think there's valuable things that our white brothers and sisters can learn from the African American community, and we can toss in the Hispanic community, so on and so forth. So, yes, I would say that would be important to submit, to mutually submit to one another in a way that's redemptive and healthy and whole. Now, Brent, what was the last part of that again?
I think he was talking about, like, do you think we need to really integrate on Sunday morning to end racism?
So I'll say it this way. Dr. Corey Edwards, who is our Yoda when it comes to the multi-ethnic church, she's a Jesus-loving black woman who's a PhD assistant professor of sociology at Ohio State University. She says that the average community that a church sits in is 10 times more diverse than that church. The average schools in that community that a church sits in is 20 times more diverse than that church. I believe the call of the local church is to reach their community, period. But the beautiful thing and the intimidating thing to a lot of churches is that God is literally bringing diversity to our communities. And so I think if you're a typical church today, that means your community is diversifying. And if you're doing a good job of reaching everybody in that community, that means that your sanctuary is reflecting what's happening in the communities and the schools. Now, are there communities where there's no diversity and there's homogeneity? Absolutely. In that case, be homogenous. But if you are in a diverse community, which is in all likelihood the case, and you're not reaching them, I think I've got a missional question to ask, and that is, what is it about the way we're doing ministry that is not attracting all people to the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ? So I'll just answer it that way, Bryan.
Yeah. Okay, so here's my follow-up. I actually have not heard this really addressed too much in like the conference world. It's more in like back rooms and conversations, but what are your thoughts and advice to the broader church when it comes to, over the last 5 years, we have not seen as many predominantly white churches desire and be very intentional about diversifying their staff. And they're so intentional about that. Diverse leadership, diverse elders, diverse teaching team, diverse worship. And it's a lot easier, I've found, and there's a lot more people of color that are open to going to those churches. However, I've not seen the same like equal enthusiasm and sacrifice from predominantly predominantly white churches to also join Black churches or Latino churches or Asian churches that are also trying to diversify in their leadership, staff, worship, elders. What are your thoughts on that, and maybe what's your advice, maybe to the white evangelical church?
Yeah, this is probably the most, the hardest thing I'll say. And I'll encapsulate it in sociological data. Recent article came out via NPR, and what the data reveals is that our white brothers and sisters will embrace, some will even endure, a multi-ethnic church until it gets to the 50% point. So this is data. What the data reveals is once a church crosses the 50% threshold, minority majority, there's a backdoor revival among our white brothers and sisters. They then speculate that the issue there is power, right? So when you can't control your environment, it just doesn't happen. So as I've worked with multi-ethnic churches who are transitioning, and Dr. Corey Edwards and I talked about this about a year and a half ago. Man, this really grieves me. There are so many cases of white churches becoming multi-ethnic. There is no case that we can think of where you have a minority church, especially a large Black church, that has gone multi-ethnic. And at the end of the day, the speculation is our white brothers and sisters don't have a whole lot of stamina as it relates to being minorities, sustained minorities.
Yes. Powerful.
You're going to think I'm the political commentator, and I'm really not here. I promise I'm not. History was made with the election of President Obama as the first Black president. History's made here as of the time we're doing this with the first woman of color elected as a vice presidential candidate. What are you hoping legacy-wise now? So we had President Obama, and now we've got Kamala Harris. What are you hoping comes of that in terms of progressing the conversation further into the future?
Yeah, so let me be very clear. I'm talking ethnically, not ideologically, not politically. I'm talking purely from an ethnic standpoint. Part of what I labor for is I want to get rid of the phrase "the first," and I just long for there to be a day when it's just President Obama or President whoever, and because this has just become so normal, right? So I would say that's the primary thing. And so as a minority, from an ethnic perspective, when I see that, there is a sense of dignity, elevated dignity. There's a sense of value that I feel. In the same way that my grandfather would sit and watch Jackie Robinson play. But I long for, just like the major leagues now, you don't use that phrase "the first." It's just kind of normal. I long for the day when we can get to that. Now, that said, let me give you some backroom talk that me and my middle-class African-American friends have as it relates to Obama. One of the things, if you just look objectively at his presidency from an ethnic policy perspective, Obama did far more for our friends in the gay community than he did for the Black community. And so that's an interesting discussion where, you look at his 8-year tenure and you go, is the Black community better off? No. The statistics actually say the wealth gap between Black and white has actually increased. It hasn't decreased. And so just because a person is our color and ethnicity doesn't mean they're going to labor really hard to help our people. So, yeah.
Question from the chat. Let's see. It's saying, what would be some public applications for biblical advocacy of justice for churches, gospel, nonprofits, and leaders. I'm thinking she's saying, or he is saying, maybe what are some organizations that you would say, that we could proudly get behind that maybe we wouldn't be aware of, and some leaders. Unless you read it, I couldn't tell exactly what it was saying, but I felt like saying what are some groups we should be listening to or paying attention to, and maybe even getting behind and giving to.
And we can expand it to resources, Bryan, for church leaders that are trying to advance this conversation and make progress. What are some resources, whether it's groups or books or conferences, that you would say are helpful to you and the church you're serving at now?
Yeah, so I would say several things here. Number one, and I know this wasn't the heartbeat of the question, I wouldn't be so quick to outsource your justice initiatives. I would encourage you as a local church to kind of fumble your way through these things, and you don't have to be an expert before you get out of the boat and you swim in these waters. So that would be the first thing I would recommend. You have to be very discerning when it comes to knowing who your people are, and then matching the resources to their ethnic maturity levels. So if you're just getting into this and you would say, man, we're at a first grade level, don't assign them the autobiography of Malcolm X. I'm being a little facetious there, but if you're just getting started, great books to read would be Tony Evans' Oneness Embraced. I would recommend George Yancey, African American sociologist, his book Beyond Racial Gridlock. This is for people who are just getting started in this space. If you're a little bit more advanced, I'd recommend Jamar Tisby's wonderful book, The Color of Compromise. Soong Chan Ra wrote a great book called Prophetic Lament. These are wonderful books that I think can help you get into that. The Southern Baptist Church, I just worked with them. They put out a great video resource called Undivided, and it's a 2-volume thing. And I'm in the second volume of that. Right Now Media, I would encourage you as a church, think about purchasing a subscription to Right Now Media. And there's a ton of resources on there that can help you press down ethnic unity across the board. So those are a few things I would suggest.
We've got another question here, Bryan, that I hear this one fairly routinely now, so I want to go ahead and ask it. Yeah. Many white evangelicals state that the solution to racism and injustice is changed hearts through the gospel. Others state that unjust policies, and I'm assuming structural and systemic biases, need to change and hearts will follow. How do you balance that spectrum? Is it an or, is it an and how do you just maneuver that spectrum?
So yeah, let me say this first. So that I think threads back to the resource deal, and I'm glad I'm thinking of this. I would say even if you're at an elementary level, Divided by Faith is a must read. Christian Smith and Michael Emerson, it's a seminal work. All roads, as it relates to ethnic unity in the church, goes back to that. 2 white Christian sociologists, and one of the things they dig out is exactly what you just said, and that is the typical white conservative evangelical narrative is kind of each one, reach one, get to the heart. We don't necessarily have to deal with the other thing. When in reality is, listen, on the one hand, I believe in total depravity. Not in extent, but not in degree, but in extent. All of us, every aspect of our life has just been colored by sin. I have a friend of mine who says, if sin were blue, we'd all be Smurfs. It just colors all of who we are. And so what happens now is when you get a group of sinners who now construct systems, those systems are going to get contaminated by our sin. And so is it personal? Yes. Is it systemic? Yes. So, for example, let me just give you one structural system that I think is a great example of systemic racism. If you look in the South, when Brown versus Board of Education begins to make its way through the South, many times it doesn't take place to the late 60s, early to mid 70s. What the white evangelical conservative community did was they said, you know what, we don't want our kids to go to the same school as minority kids. So they built their own Christian schools, private schools, and they priced out the ethnic minority demographic. Well, friends, I tell you, that is a system. If you want to get more into systemic injustice, read the wonderful book, The Color of Law. You have to read that. It's going to show you what systemic injustice looks like. So when we talk about principalities and powers, Ephesians chapter 6, I think that's a clear reference to Satan works not just on an individual level, but he works on a systemic level. And so I would just say we have to be about the redemption and the restoration of all things, both people's hearts and unjust systems.
We've got time for one more question, and then we'll let, if you have any closing thoughts after that too, Bryan. So do you want to pick one of them, or do you want me to there, Grant?
You can pick one. Go ahead.
Bryan, on the 5 levels of communication, or just in the communication side of things, in your own experience, what's the most difficult thing for you, and how do you overcome it to engage in healthy conversation on race? What, for you, even as a person of color, what's the challenge to engage in a healthy conversation, and how do you press through that and turn it into an opportunity?
For me, healthy conversations on race and ethnic unity, it all rises and falls on the posture of the person on the other side of you. If that person comes to me in humility, honestly seeking answers, they may disagree at the end of the day, but that's a healthy conversation I want to be a part of. If a person comes almost from a defensive, even attacking mode, that's what makes the conversation difficult. It's not even about what we're talking about. It's the posture of the people who are engaging in dialogue. And so that's where I think, listen, I have problems with opponents of critical race theory. I have a lot of problems with opponents of it. But I do think they are onto something. Even when we look at it from a minority perspective, the idea of critical race theory is one of the tenets is we kind of see the world oppressed versus oppressor. And so I think what makes these conversations hard is when a person comes into the conversation already in their mind pronouncing you as guilty. And just because of the color of your skin, or just because of where you, and they're just going to stand in that, and they're going to be entrenched in that. And there's no real humility. There's no real possibility for change there. That's what makes these conversations tough.
Well, it's been a real blessing to have you, Bryan. If there's any kind of final thoughts that you have, we're going to wind down here, and we really do appreciate you taking the time and investing in our exponential community this way.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. You know, I often tell people I'm laboring for a time I will not personally see. I'm laboring for my kids' generation. You know, when my kids were younger, they came with me one time. I had to speak at a church, and you know, they've always been involved in multi-ethnic churches. And one of them said to me in the middle of this service where I'm serving as a guest, "Dad, why is this church all white?" And not that all white churches are bad or whatever, or all black churches, but I said, that's it. His normal is what our future eternal reality is going to be. And so let's not grow weary in well-doing. Let's continue to love one another, have hard conversations, and keep pressing forward.
Right.
Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Grant. We'll see everybody next week.
Thank you.